Ladies and gentlemen, independent Americans around the country and around the world, this is a very, very hard time. A hard time in America, a hard time in the world. And the guest we have joining us in this episode is literally the perfect person to talk to right now. I was trying to figure out who to talk to about everything, and especially about this massacre in Texas. And like the stars were in alignment. And I had this guest scheduled because Memorial Day is coming up this weekend. And I am absolutely positive it is the perfect person to help us all through this moment. A mentor of mine, a hero of mine, a friend, the great and powerful Bonnie Carroll returns back to Independent Americans. Welcome back, Bonnie.
Oh, Paul, and back at you. You have been such a support to me over all of these years, and I appreciate you being a battle buddy on the journey.
It's been some journey, Bonnie. It just keeps getting interestinger and interestinger. Last time you were on was May 20th, 2020. The pandemic had just started. We were going into the first Memorial Day of the pandemic. I want to talk about Memorial Day coming up. I want to talk about Ukraine. I want to talk about grief and how we can get through this moment. But I do always want to start with the person I'm talking to. Where are you today and how are you?
Paul, I'm great. I'm in Washington, D.C. Actually, this is our 28th annual National Military Survivor Seminar and Good Grief Camp. TAPS is the program for the families of America's fallen heroes. And now for the past nearly 30 years, we have been bringing families together to find hope and healing and resources and support and participate in everything that's happening in our nation's capital over this Memorial Day weekend.
So I think about you often. And it may seem strange to folks, but I feel like being with TAPS this weekend and having been around the good grief camps and seeing what you're doing with these kids might be like the perfect place to be right now, right? Because we're all trying to sort through what this latest horrible massacre means. And today, I mentioned to you when we were getting ready, I'm going to go to my kids' school for their concert. They're like their end of the year concert. My big guys in first grade, my little guys in preschool. It's going to be really, really emotional. But being with the kids is going to feel like the right place to be. And you've been doing this, year after year, all the way back since when you started TAPS and your husband died. Can you start with this moment, Bonnie? Like, pull us back. For those of us that are trying to make sense of this moment, we're 24 hours, not even 24 hours out. Help us through it. What are you thinking? What are you feeling? What wisdom do you have for all of us dealing with this grief and this sorrow and this trauma and this anger and everything else that goes with it?
And Paul, it is absolutely horrific, but what makes it so personal is we can all relate. We have kids in schools. We can feel what it must be like to get that call that your child has been injured or killed. It is just striking to the heart of America and to our most precious, innocent children. It's unconscionable that this has occurred. It's impossible to understand or put into any sort of context that makes it acceptable. Is it mental illness? Is it a gun rights issue? And what can we do? It seems almost impossible to make it stop. And it also has become now political, which makes it even more challenging and more complicated. But for our families, TAPS is there for the families who have experienced a devastating loss of a loved one in the military. A lot of people think death in the military only comes in combat because that's what's seen on the news. But Paul, as you know, as a combat veteran, and what I know as a military veteran, as an Army surviving spouse, death comes in many ways to our men and women in uniform. War is different today. If you were shot on the battlefield in World War I or World War II, you died in the foxhole. If you were shot in the jungles of Vietnam, chances are you did not survive. But today, our men and women who were deployed in the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, if they were injured on the battlefield, they may have been cared for immediately by a corpsman or a medic that's carrying an ICU on their back, and they may have gotten out. So for families, the death of the loved one may have taken place back home in America, after lengthy illnesses, battles with injuries, or even a suicide as a result of post-traumatic stress. But that's our military family. We've been able to take what we've learned about grief and trauma and relate it to the civilian community. I've been called on a lot this morning and last night to talk about traumatic loss and how impossible it is to just put it into a context of our own life, and how we can somehow find safety and security. How do we feel we can keep our own kids safe now? And as you go to the school this morning, that's going to be top of your mind.
Bonnie, you've been there more times than I can count. I've texted you in the middle of the night. I've called you and said, okay, we've got a family that needs you. I called you a couple of weeks ago when Brent Renaud was killed in Ukraine, the first high-profile journalist. I connected you with his family, and you've been infinitely helpful to them. And there are times when people are really in so much deep pain. And what I say to them is, Bonnie will understand. Bonnie will know what to do. I don't know what to do. I haven't been there, but Bonnie is like a Jedi of grief and trauma and sorrow. We call you Saint Bonnie. When you walk around the Pentagon, you are so revered. When you walk around other communities, you are so, but with good reason, because you're always there. Joe Biden tried to talk about this last night, and I think he did it very effectively from a personal standpoint, as someone who has lost a child. What do you say to somebody, Bonnie, when you talk to them today? If you talk to one of these families that's just lost their child, you've been there. It was the phone call that you got yourself, but what do you say to them?
Paul, you're very kind. And I just want to say how much I've learned from you over the years, and that we do this together. We are a community. We come together to help each other, to elevate the voice, to bring support and resources. When my husband was killed, it is absolutely impossible to comprehend at that moment what has occurred. What we can do for families immediately is to provide the support, make it as easy as possible to get through this period, to honor the life lived and remember, but recognize that this is a journey for the rest of their lives. Talking to Brent Renaud's mom, we talked about Brent. We remembered the life lived and just talked about how that legacy continues. Paul, it's an interesting thing that we only grieve because we love. Grief is intrinsically tied to the love we have for someone we have lost. And therefore, that love, we don't stop loving that person. That love transcends the loss of the physical person. And at TAPS, it's a big part of what we do. We shift the pain of the grief to the love of the person. And how are we going to carry that forward? How will we become the living legacies? How will we be better people because they lived? And whether that was a young school child who was senselessly gunned down, or a soldier serving in our military who their life ended far too soon, or whether it's an elderly person, we make them part of who we are. We weave who they were into the fabric of who we will become. And we have to be better because they lived.
You've taught me, to mourn their passing and celebrate their life. And that's a really hard thing to understand when you're in that painful moment. And the loss of a child or a loved one, especially in a traumatic incident, is not something I think you can understand unless you've been through it. I've said this before. I think there are some things that you only understand if you've been through it. And I think that's one of them. Combat is another one. I think parenthood is another one. I think the pandemic is another one. Like, how do you ever capture all of it, right? Unless you've been through it. But you do approach it with love, and you give people community. And in that darkest moment, there's something else that when I try to get them to talk to you, which is sometimes hard, I sometimes appeal to the future and say, you don't know it. You're in this moment. You don't know what you need to do. You don't know even the administrative stuff like burials, right? And resources that you are masters of and your team are masters of. But there will be a time on the other side where there's going to be a family that needs you. And I've seen that cycle happen so many times when they make it through this time when their heads are spinning. And you see it with somebody like Fred Gutenberg, right? Who's been a guest on the show. He lost his daughter, Jamie, and he's everywhere in the media this week. He's now helping other families. He's helping the families in Texas now because of what he experienced. But that journey that you take them through is really, I think, important. Do you find, how do you nobody else could do it but you, right? Or someone like you,
Well,
because you've lost your husband. You make that connection and they trust you. But can you talk about that first 24, 48, 72 hours? Biden said it feels like the whole world is spinning. What do you see in that moment that we need to understand as someone who maybe hasn't been through it?
oh, Paul, and you know what? I just want to go back to something that you said that is so important. It is that what we call peer-based emotional support. It's because we have been through that. Ironically, before my husband was killed while serving in the Army, and along with 7 other soldiers in an Army plane crash, I thought I was a pretty empathetic person. I was involved in my civilian job at the time, working with victims of violent crime, and I was on the board of an organization for survivors of homicide loss, and worked with another group for families of fallen police officers. I was even trained by the military to be a critical incident stress debriefer in the event of a mass trauma, and had worked in the community on that. It wasn't until Tom was killed, and it happened to me in my life, that I really understood just how absolutely devastating and all encompassing that personal loss is. And it's interesting when I talk to families. At first, they don't know who we are as an organization or what support we're bringing, and it's a little bit of a formal conversation. And somehow in that conversation, if I just weave in, well, when my husband was killed, and just like that, the conversation shifts. And it's all about now, oh my God, how did you survive? How did you cope? It's creating that safe space that from the heart. Paul, grief is not a mental illness. It isn't a physical injury. It isn't something that we can have really a clinical intervention or a medication that's going to make it go away. Grief is a broken heart. And the only people who can understand that and come alongside and create, as I said, that safe space to just find a way forward, to know that you're not alone and that others have survived this horrific moment in time, is the only thing that will help. It really is so powerful. That's what TAPS is based upon. And last year we had 9,246 newly bereaved military survivors who came to us for care. They were paired one-on-one with a peer mentor, and that's a person who has been there before them with a similar loss. And for the kids at the Good Grief Camp, we bring alongside military mentors who we train, who kind of become kids themselves once again and can be a support. So you're absolutely right. Being with someone who gets it and who can create that safe space to normalize and validate a absolutely incomprehensible circumstance is critical.
Bonnie, this is you've done so much for so long. You've been awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom. You've been recognized around the world. And, I would love there to be a time and a place where you get to retire and go to Alaska and chill out, right? Or maybe run for governor or Senate if I could. So, right. But I think, unfortunately, this is our new normal, and grief is now so all encompassing. I saw a tweet today that said there's going to be so much trauma, they're not even going to have time to grieve in the future, right? We've got a pandemic. We've had 20 years of war. Now we've got Ukraine, and the entire, European continent is experiencing trauma and grief. We're going to need you, right? And I said in some tweets that Biden is kind of built for this moment. All of that trauma and personal loss and losing his children, especially his daughter, when she was so young, is going to be additive and steel him for this moment. But now, when I texted you a couple of weeks ago, you're in Europe. You've been all around the world. As soon as Ukraine happens, of course, Bonnie is rushing in to help the people of Ukraine and the surrounding region. So we've covered that at length on this show. We're in a weird place now where Ukraine is sending condolences to America today. Yeah. Zelensky is tweeting to us his sorrow and which is just bizarro world. But can you explain what you've been doing and what your team has been doing on the ground in Ukraine and throughout the region?
Well, Paul, back in 2015, the U.S. State Department came to TAPS and asked us to mentor the creation of an organization for the surviving families who had lost loved ones in Crimea and Donbass. So my first trip to Ukraine to meet the surviving families was back in 2016. I mean, we've been with them for 7 years now. Amazing people. We have a beautiful partnership. We built a program. Well, they built it with our support that absolutely became one of the biggest organizations in the country. TAPS Ukraine is very well known there and respected. It's headquartered in Dnipro, which is in eastern Ukraine, just 2 hours from the front lines. And the surviving family members, Elena Shokyab is a widow who lost her husband in 2014. She became a military psychologist. She works with the troops on trauma counseling, and she is right there every day now as a survivor, but also as a clinician helping folks. We've got a major operation now going where our TAPS Ukraine volunteers are comforting children, they're providing meals, they're doing whatever it takes. They're actually also managing the morgue, and they just have incredible strength and courage. But I've been to Dnipro and Kyiv probably, a dozen times over the years. We've done training and conferences. They've been here to see what we do 5 or 6 times, and it really has become a very, very close family. So we've been preparing for this for 7 years, and they're ready.
Bonnie, when you're given your expertise, if you were, I mean, not to at all dismiss it, but if you were a weather, predictor, meteorologist, I'd ask you, like, how big is this earthquake compared to historic earthquakes, right? How big is this tsunami versus others? The scope of grief and trauma that we're seeing in Ukraine, have you seen anything like this in your lifetime? And how do you put it in metrics versus what we've seen in the last couple of decades?
I mean, this is really on the scale I feel of the Holocaust. It is a genocide. It was just the completely unnecessary elimination of such a good people. I had the opportunity in early May to be in Israel for Remembrance Day, and that was the feeling and the tension that here we're witnessing this again. Everything we know of the Holocaust was, well, we didn't know, we weren't aware, but now we have social media, we have videos, we have drone footage, we do know, and it is overwhelming to even try to comprehend the magnitude of the losses, not only on the Ukrainian side, but also watching it on what's happening to the Russians who, were sent in to do this barbaric act. It's absolutely devastating. What we've been able to do is help the Ukrainian people as best we can from afar and with our team on the ground, just keep that steady state, keep those positive things happening, and emphasize I don't know if you saw Eurovision when Ukraine won. I mean, that was just this moment of release of joy in the midst of horrific trauma was for a moment just healing and hopeful. So that's what we can do. We raised the money for 2 ambulances. And yesterday they had the press conference about these 2 ambulances that have arrived in Dnipro, and that it's going to save lives, that it's going to bring hope, that America stands with Ukraine, just as we're standing with the families in Texas, and just as we do. That is what we do best. It is. And, yeah.
Please. And I think I visited one of your one of your facilities in Texas at some point. I don't know if it was at Fort Hood or somewhere else, but San Antonio is obviously a really critical part to the military and to the military medical community. But you're at every epicenter. You're in Ukraine, you're in Texas, you've been in Afghanistan and supporting widows and survivors there. And now we've got Memorial Day 2022, which frankly, I don't know how to process. Right. I know in my heart that people are going to care about Memorial Day. A lot of the folks that you're supporting have lost people to burn pits, to suicide, to so much else that is going to be wrapped into Memorial Day. But I also know the country might be a little desensitized to it. And because it's been politicized, especially in my view, in the last administration, stuff around the military isn't as embraced as it once was. I worry a little bit that we have kind of grief fatigue. And that soldiers, you're going to put an 82nd Airborne tough guy or gal soldier versus a fourth grader. And you're going to say, yeah, I care about that soldier, but this fourth grader, I mean, how are we going to process this Memorial Day? How can we, I know our community, we're going to want to use this Memorial Day to shine our light and spread our love and resources around the community. But every Memorial Day is different. Can you frame up this one in 2022 and what you think it means for our community and what it means for the country?
Well, it is the nation's opportunity to pause and remember all those who have served and sacrificed for freedom and died in defense of democracy. I don't know if you saw Malcolm Nance's interview on MSNBC, one of his many, where they asked him, are you willing to die for the cause in Ukraine? Because he is there now as part of the Legion after retiring from the Navy. And I loved his answer. He immediately shot back. He said, I was willing, I committed to die for democracy the day I enlisted in the United States military. And that was an interesting shift. You know, our men and women in uniform step forward to serve, and they do make that commitment to die for democracy. And that's what we honor on Memorial Day, that there are men and women who will serve in defense of freedom. We're seeing how fragile that freedom is in Ukraine now, that one person, one foreign leader had the ability now to inflict so much pain on another country. And I'm hopeful that on Memorial Day, that's what we take away, that we honor our men and women who serve. And, you know, Paul, it is a very complicated time because our nation is also grieving tremendous loss. And it's not just the loss of those children, but what that means is the loss of our own sense of security and safety, what it means for children to go to school and know that they can come home every day, and that we don't have to worry about, they don't have to have active shooter drills in schools. So that is yet another loss. It's another thing that's been taken away from us. So as a nation, we need to raise the awareness of how to cope with that. How do we normalize and validate the feelings that we're having and know that they are normal reactions to a very abnormal event? We've got to address that. We've got to understand it. And we've got to have the tools to cope with it so that we can go on and not have that sense of safety and security robbed from us by an 18-year-old with an agenda.
I think there's so much wisdom in that, Bonnie. And the one thing that I keep coming back to is, you know, the old saying that medicine is the only victor in war. And you have learned so much, and your team has learned so much in dealing with 20 years plus of mental health, of trauma, of all of it, burn pits, suicide, cancer, you know, broken families, all of it. Like, you all have been doing this. When I started IABA back in 2004 and we had Memorial Day, we used to say, okay, Memorial Day is when everybody goes to the mall or to the beach and we go to Arlington. It was hard to communicate and bridge that gap with a country that you felt like hadn't experienced grief. Now that's changed, especially with the pandemic. You know, especially with the massacres and the school shootings, the feeling of fear and instability. I think people are more connected to loss now than they were before. And there's a powerful insight here in that we can learn so much from TAPS. You have been the tip of the spear. If Elon Musk is listening, I hope he will send billions to you instead of trying to buy Twitter. All the billionaires out there. I really mean it. Like, if Bonnie Carroll had endless money, this would be a very different world, not just from an emotional standpoint, but from a tactical standpoint, a practical standpoint. You have process in place to help people at scale who are experiencing grief. And I think that that's really important. You're also really good at getting stuff done, Bonnie. Like, you know, many times over the years, we had veterans legislation and we needed someone to kind of pull people through it. And you are able to talk to both sides. You worked in the White House in the Reagan administration. I know you're very artful and careful in how you engage politically, but this is a time where we're looking to Washington. We're looking them to do something, right? And burn pits legislation is also in the wing, something you and I and others have been working for a generation. Can you talk about, is there a way forward? Like, I feel like if we put Bonnie Carroll in the room with Mitch McConnell and Chuck Schumer, you know, something will get done. And you're very independent. You're an independent American, in my view, in all the greatest ways. Can you talk about any path forward you see politically in the middle of all this mess?
Well, I really am. Thank you for that, Paul. And I really am encouraged by President Biden has become a personal friend because of the losses that he has felt and his engagement with TAPS when he was vice president. So we do have a regular dialogue about this. We're talking about what Secretary McDonough can do to open up the presumptions on the burn pits to help, families to raise the level of awareness about the cancers. We've got a rally in Washington, D.C. on Saturday afternoon with your buddy, Jon Stewart, who's going to be there. And again, just bringing this to the forefront and constantly changing what we can control for the better. We can't go back and take away the exposures that have occurred for our military from those toxins while deployed or some of the other things, but we can address the trauma that our veterans and our service members are experiencing and feeling now that is resulting in suicides. We can help our surviving families have access to benefits with, a service connection for illness loss, and we can help America cope with the trauma and grief that they are experiencing. We know how to do this. We know how to get through this. And you're absolutely right. We just need those avenues to make the connections to get to folks.
Well, and we also, you're so diplomatic. We need leaders that people actually trust. And there are very few that I know, having worked in Washington for almost 20 years, who can get people together in a way that disarms them politically. Right. I mean, you've had great relationships with Republicans and Democrats, all sides. I wish we could literally have you as like the mediator on all things in Washington. Like, we don't seem to be able to get anything done for this gun problem and this mass shooting problem. I feel like if Bonnie Carroll went into the room with Chuck Schumer and McConnell, maybe you can bonk their heads together or use your Jedi magic and get them to work together. And I hope you'll stick around for a couple of Patreon questions at the end. I know your time is really valuable, especially this week. Let me ask you kind of a final question, Bonnie. How do you do it? I have asked you this before because you're my friend, and sometimes I look to you for support. But I'm getting a lot of texts from leaders who are tired, who feel worn out. I think the country feels that way. Even in this conversation, you're great at raising up hope and adding, a future vision and talking about path forward. But how do you do it? How do you live in this world of grief and pain and loss day after day and keep going?
Oh, and Paul, and like you, I always say there are people that run towards the fire and they become firemen. There are people that run towards the sound of the bullets, and that's just the way we're wired. I was honored to serve in the military, was honored to be married to a great soldier, and now honored to carry forward his legacy and be there for the surviving families who are experiencing trauma. But I do think it feeds our souls when we can provide support to another. Because we have the tools to be helpful and we're not going into a situation helpless and just saying, oh, gee, I'm really sorry this has happened to you. Too bad. But we can go into a situation and say, we have resources and support. We have a community that's going to be wrapped around you. We have the resources that can meet your emergency financial needs right now. We can do something proactive. So we're going into a situation as peers, but with the tools and resources to offer support. And that makes a big difference. When the fireman runs towards the fire, he's got the hose in the water. He's got something he can do to proactively make the situation better. And that's what really gives us the strength who are coming into that. When I was in Warsaw about 2 weeks ago, just happened upon a makeshift memorial of just printed out pictures of those who had died in Ukraine. And one of those was Brent Renault. And he was, just as I took a selfie, he was right over my shoulder, and I sent it to his mom. And I said, he's right here. He is remembered. His name is spoken. His picture is seen. And there was a Ukrainian woman, a refugee who was passing through. She stopped and we just hugged and sobbed together over the magnitude of the losses. And she was on her way to England. When she got to London, she made her new host call me to let me know in English that she had arrived safely. And it was just this beautiful community of honoring Brent, of finding safety and security, of making a difference where we can in the world. And that's what makes you a better person, and what you're doing here to give a voice to all of us, and what I hope I'm able to do for our families.
Oh boy, do you do it. I mean, we always say, look for the helpers on this show. You are the embodiment of what that means. And you give people agency. You give them, a feeling that they can make a difference. And there's also another thing that you do, which is like you kind of create a version of the world and how it could be and should be. Like if folks want something on their bucket list, go to Arlington at some point and go be with TAPS and be with veterans on Memorial Day weekend. And if you can, be around the good grief camps, because folks think it's going to be just all crying and sad. They think it's so sad, I can't handle it. Like, it's the most empowering, inspiring, like it fills your cup up, and you see so many people that are making a difference and paying it forward and smiling and laughing. And the kids, like this world where the kids are celebrated and the future is celebrated and legacies are celebrated. It's a lot, in my view, of how America should be. So Bonnie for president. I think Bonnie should run for president, and you would get a lot of independent support. But until then, I just want to thank you for all that you do. You are a true hero and a role model to all of us and to me and so many others. We love you. We adore you. And everyone listening should do everything they can to support Bonnie and everything they do at TAPS.
Thank you, Paul. It's an honor to be with you.
And I hope you get some rest, and then you can go up to Alaska and maybe run against Sarah Palin, but that's for another time. That's for another time. Thank you for all you do. Stay vigilant, Bonnie.
Thank you.
Okay.